Imagine standing before a conqueror so ruthless that his very name became synonymous with terror across 2 continents. A man who didn't just kill his enemies, but transformed their deaths into performances of calculated horror, designed to echo through history as warnings to anyone who dared oppose him. Genghis Khan's execution methods weren't merely acts of violence. They were instruments of psychological warfare, carefully crafted to break the spirit of entire civilizations before a single arrow was loosed. Today, we delve into the darkest chambers of Mongol justice, where death itself became a weapon more powerful than any sword. The world of the 13th century was brutal by any standard, but Genghis Khan elevated cruelty to an art form with purpose. Born as Temujin around 1162 in the harsh steppes of Mongolia, he would unite the fractious Mongol tribes and forge the largest contiguous land empire in human history. His conquests stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, encompassing territories that would today include more than 30 modern nations. Yet his military genius was matched only by his willingness to employ terror as a strategic tool. The executions he ordered were never random acts of sadistic pleasure, but deliberate messages inscribed in blood and suffering. Understanding Khan's execution methods requires grasping the cultural and strategic context of Mongol warfare. The steppes produced warriors for whom mercy was a foreign concept, where survival itself depended on absolute dominance over enemies and the natural world alike. Genghis Khan inherited this harsh worldview and refined it into a philosophy of conquest. He believed that resistance to Mongol rule deserved the most severe punishment imaginable, while those who surrendered peacefully would be spared. This binary approach to justice created a system where execution methods served as both punishment and propaganda, designed to convince cities and kingdoms that submission was preferable to the horrors that awaited those who fought. The Mongol legal code, known as the Yasa, codified many of Khan's principles regarding crime and punishment. This remarkable document, though only fragmentary records survive, established clear guidelines for when execution was warranted and sometimes specified the methods to be employed. Interestingly, the Yasa showed surprising leniency in some areas. Theft of small amounts could be forgiven, and religious tolerance was mandated throughout the empire. However, crimes against the state, betrayal, and resistance to Mongol authority demanded the ultimate penalty. The executions that followed were not haphazard brutality, but carefully considered demonstrations designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Perhaps the most infamous execution method attributed to Genghis Khan was the practice of bloodless execution for nobility and royalty. According to Mongol tradition and shamanic beliefs, royal blood was sacred and should not be spilled upon the earth. This superstition led to one of history's most bizarre execution techniques. Victims would be wrapped tightly in carpets or felt blankets, and then trampled to death by horses or crushed beneath heavy objects. The Shah Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire, though he died fleeing Khan's forces, exemplified the type of ruler who might have faced this fate. His son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, witnessed numerous Khwarezmian nobles executed in this manner after their capture. Contemporary chroniclers, particularly Persian historians who documented the Mongol invasions, described these carpet executions with horrified fascination. Atta Malik Juvaini, a Persian historian who served under the Mongols, wrote extensively about their conquest methods. He recorded that noblemen would be rolled so tightly in felt or carpets that they could barely breathe, then placed in the path of Mongol cavalry units conducting maneuvers. The thunder of hundreds of hooves would gradually crush the life from the victims, a process that could take many agonizing minutes. The psychological impact on witnesses was devastating. Seeing their leaders reduced to shapeless bundles, hearing muffled screams gradually fade to silence, watching the carpet slowly flatten and darken with blood that never touched the ground. The reasoning behind this method extended beyond mere superstition. By avoiding the shedding of blood, the Mongols believed they prevented the victim's spirit from seeking revenge in the afterlife. Additionally, this form of execution was deeply humiliating for the victim, denying them an honorable warrior's death. In the martial cultures of Central Asia and the Middle East, dying in battle with weapon in hand was considered the highest honor. To be wrapped helplessly like a piece of furniture and crushed without even seeing one's executioners represented the ultimate degradation. It stripped away every shred of dignity and transformed powerful rulers into anonymous casualties, their final moments defined by helplessness and suffocation in darkness. Another execution method that showcased Khan's strategic cruelty was the practice of pouring molten silver or gold into the eyes and ears of captured officials. This particularly horrific fate was often reserved for corrupt administrators, tax collectors who had exploited their positions, or governors who had betrayed their oaths. The symbolism was unmistakable. Those who had been blinded by greed and deafened to the suffering of their people would experience a literal manifestation of their crimes. The Mongols understood the power of poetic justice, and this execution method served as both punishment and cautionary tale to other officials throughout the empire. The most detailed account of this execution method comes from the fate of Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, who precipitated the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. In 1218, Inalchuk made a fatal error. He seized a Mongol trade caravan, executed the merchants, and confiscated their goods, claiming they were spies. When Genghis Khan demanded justice, Shah Muhammad II refused to surrender the governor, instead executing Khan's ambassadors, an unforgivable insult in Mongol culture. The subsequent invasion devastated Central Asia, and when Otrar finally fell in 1220 after a 5-month siege, Inalchuk was captured alive. Contemporary sources describe his execution with gruesome precision. According to multiple Persian and Arab chroniclers, Inalchuk was brought before the Mongol commanders in chains. His fate had been decreed by Genghis Khan personally. Molten silver would be poured into his eyes and ears until death released him. The execution was conducted publicly, with officials from surrounding regions forced to witness. Witnesses described how executioners first restrained the governor completely, holding his head immobile. Crucibles of silver were heated until the metal liquefied, glowing white-hot. The first pour into the ear canal would have caused instantaneous, indescribable agony as the molten metal burned through delicate tissues, boiling away fluids and destroying the inner ear structures. The victim's screams would have been horrific, echoing across the execution ground, serving the Mongols' purpose of terrorizing observers. The molten silver would continue its destructive path, potentially reaching the brain itself, causing seizures and unimaginable pain. Then the process would be repeated with the other ear and both eyes. Pouring molten metal into the eyes would cause the vitreous fluid to boil explosively, and the eyeballs themselves would burst from the heat and pressure. The optic nerves would be instantly cauterized, and the silver would pool in the eye sockets before potentially dripping through into the nasal cavity and throat. Death might come from shock, from the destruction of vital brain tissues, or from suffocation as molten metal flowed down the airways. What made this execution particularly effective as psychological warfare was its duration and visibility. Unlike a quick beheading or arrow to the heart, this death unfolded over several agonizing minutes, allowing the full horror to impress itself upon all witnesses. The victim's body would convulse violently, muscles contracting in response to the trauma, limbs thrashing against restraints. The smell of burning flesh and hair would permeate the area, creating a sensory memory that witnesses would carry forever. And when death finally arrived, the corpse would be left on display, silver tears frozen on the cheeks, metallic streams hardened in the ear canals, a grotesque statue warning others against betraying the Mongol Khan. The strategic brilliance of such executions becomes clear when examining their aftermath. News of Inalchuk's fate spread rapidly throughout Central Asia and the Middle East. Subsequent Mongol campaigns encountered far less resistance from local governors and officials, many of whom chose immediate surrender rather than risk similar punishment. Genghis Khan's investment in spectacular cruelty thus saved Mongol lives and accelerated conquests by making potential enemies too terrified to resist. It was terror as military strategy, elevated to a level of sophistication that modern psychological operations would recognize. Another particularly disturbing execution method employed by Genghis Khan involved the systematic destruction of a victim's identity and legacy before death. When the Mongols captured Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II's mother, Turkan Khatun, she was subjected to an execution designed to erase her existence. This powerful woman had effectively ruled the Khwarezmian Empire from behind the throne, influencing her son's disastrous decisions that led to the Mongol invasion. Her fate illustrated how Khan's executions targeted not just the body, but the very concept of the victim's historical significance. Turkan Khatun was reportedly sewn into a donkey's hide while it was still warm and fresh. As the hide dried and contracted in the sun, it would slowly constrict around her body, compressing her limbs and torso with inexorable force. This process could take days, during which time the victim would experience progressively increasing pressure, difficulty breathing, and circulation being cut off to extremities. The symbolism was profound. The woman who had wrapped herself in royal power and luxury was now wrapped in the hide of a lowly beast of burden, her status inverted in the most humiliating manner possible. Contemporary accounts suggest that victims of this execution method would be displayed publicly during their slow death, positioned where both Mongol soldiers and local populations could observe their gradual deterioration. As the hide contracted, the victims' screams would become increasingly desperate and their breathing more labored. Circulation cut off to the limbs would cause them to swell grotesquely, then turn dark as tissue began to necrotize. The psychological torture of watching one's own body slowly crushed and suffocated, knowing death was inevitable but might be days away, broke even the strongest spirits. Observers reported that victims would beg for a swift death, offering information or treasure in exchange for mercy that never came. The removal of identity extended beyond the physical suffering. The Mongols would deliberately obscure records of who the person had been, referring to them only as the one in the hide or similar dismissive terms. No burial rites were performed according to the victim's religious or cultural traditions. Instead, the body might be left where scavengers could reach it or disposed of in unmarked locations. This practice reflected a uniquely Mongol form of execution, the obliteration not just of life, but of historical presence. In cultures where legacy and remembrance were considered forms of immortality, this represented a death more final than mere physical destruction. The Mongol practice of executing by drowning in a wooden cage represents another example of their psychological sophistication in methods of death. This particular execution was often reserved for those who had violated sacred oaths or committed betrayal against the Khan personally. The victim would be secured inside a wooden cage, barely large enough to contain their body. Then the cage would be submerged in a river or lake. The bars of the cage ensured that the victim could see the surface, could watch the light filtering through the water above them, but could never reach it. This created a unique form of torment, hope constantly visible, but perpetually unattainable. Chronicles from the Mongol conquests describe several instances of this execution method being applied to turncoat generals or officials who had sworn loyalty to the Khan and then betrayed that trust. One particularly detailed account involves a Chinese general who had defected to the Mongols, received honors and position, then attempted to sell military intelligence to Song dynasty forces. When his treachery was discovered, Genghis Khan personally ordered the drowning cage as his punishment. The general was transported to the Yellow River, and in front of his former troops, the cage was constructed around him while he stood waist-deep in the water. The execution itself was horrifically methodical. The cage, roughly 6 feet tall and 3 feet square, was assembled piece by piece, boards nailed into place while the victim stood helplessly inside. Once complete, the top was sealed and weights were attached to ensure it would sink but not rest on the bottom. Instead, it would hover suspended in the water column, moved by currents but going nowhere. The victim could see through the gaps between boards as the cage was dragged toward deeper water. He could feel the water rising up his legs, his waist, his chest, knowing exactly what was coming but powerless to prevent it. As the cage was released and began to sink, witnesses described the victim's escalating panic. His hands would grip the wooden bars, shaking them futilely as water rose to his neck, then his chin. There would be a moment, a single crystalline moment, when only his face remained above water, mouth gasping desperately for one more breath, eyes wide with primal terror. Then the water would close over his head, and the real agony would begin. Unlike simple drowning, where unconsciousness comes relatively quickly, the cage allowed the victim to push his face against the top bars, potentially finding small air pockets. This extended the dying process, creating false hope that made each subsequent submersion more psychologically devastating. The drowning process itself is horrifically uncomfortable, even without the added psychological torments. As water enters the airways, the larynx spasms in an attempt to prevent fluid from reaching the lung. This laryngospasm creates a sensation of strangulation, making it impossible to breathe in or out. Panic becomes absolute as the body's most primal need, oxygen, goes unmet. Carbon dioxide builds in the bloodstream, creating a burning sensation throughout the body and an overwhelming compulsion to breathe. Eventually, the laryngospasm relaxes and water floods the lungs. If cold water, this can sometimes trigger a mammalian diving reflex that extends survival time slightly, making the torture last even longer. Inside the cage, the victim might survive for several minutes, consciousness fading in and out as the brain was periodically deprived of oxygen, then received minimal amounts through whatever air remained. Current and wave action would rock the cage, sometimes bringing the top briefly near the surface, creating false hope before dragging it back down. The victim's final moments would be a confused mixture of panic, hallucination, and the sensation of drowning repeatedly. When death finally came, the body would remain in the cage, preserved beneath the water as a warning. The Mongols would sometimes mark the location with stakes or signs, informing travelers that beneath the surface lay one who had betrayed the Khan, a ghost story in physical form. The execution of the Tangut king Li Xian demonstrates perhaps the most psychologically complex method attributed to Genghis Khan. The Western Xia dynasty, ruled by the Tanguts, had repeatedly defied Mongol demands for tribute and military assistance. When Khan finally launched his campaign against them in 1227, he was already in declining health, possibly suffering from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse. His anger toward the Tanguts was personal and profound, and he reportedly swore that their civilization would be completely erased from history. King Li Xian's execution was designed to inaugurate this policy of civilizational annihilation. According to fragmentary accounts preserved in Mongol and Chinese sources, Li Xian was not immediately killed after surrendering the Tangut capital. Instead, he was forced to witness the systematic destruction of his kingdom. City after city was razed, populations massacred or enslaved, libraries and temples burned. The Tangut written language was deliberately targeted for extinction, with scholars who could read or write it hunted down and killed. Li Xian was moved from location to location, always kept alive to watch the obliteration of everything he had ruled. This psychological torture lasted weeks, during which he was well fed and clothed in royal garments, a mockery of his powerless status. The execution itself, when it finally came, reflected this theme of erasure. Rather than a spectacular public death, Li Xian simply vanished from the historical record at a certain point. Some sources suggest he was strangled quietly in his tent one night. Others claim he was given a poison that left no trace. Still others whisper that he was entombed alive in an unmarked location, neither dead nor alive, but simply removed from existence. The very ambiguity seems deliberate. A king whose death was so thoroughly unmemorable that even its manner cannot be definitively stated. In a culture that valued glorious deaths and remembrance, this was perhaps the cruelest execution of all. The fate of the Tangut people following their king's death illustrated the full horror of Khan's policy. The Mongol forces systematically destroyed nearly every settlement in the western Xia territory. Irrigation systems were demolished, fields salted, and populations massacred with a thoroughness that shocked even veteran Mongol warriors. The Tangut language, a unique member of the Tibeto-Burman family, disappeared so completely that modern scholars can only partially reconstruct it from fragmentary inscriptions. Entire architectural traditions, artistic styles, and cultural practices vanished within a single generation. This was execution extended from one man to an entire civilization, the ultimate expression of Genghis Khan's power. The practice of death by 1,000 arrows represented one of the more visibly spectacular execution methods in the Mongol arsenal. This method was typically reserved for military leaders who had fought particularly effectively against Mongol forces, as it served both as punishment and as a demonstration of Mongol archery prowess. The victim would be tied to a wooden post or frame in an open area, sometimes stripped naked, sometimes left in their armor. Then, at a signal, Mongol archers would begin shooting arrows into their body, carefully aiming to avoid immediately fatal wounds and prolong the victim's suffering. The Mongols were arguably the finest archers in human history, capable of hitting targets accurately from horseback at full gallop. Their composite bows were technological marvels constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that provided extraordinary power and range. An experienced Mongol archer could place an arrow exactly where intended from over 200 yards away. This precision was essential for the 1,000 arrows execution to achieve its intended effect. The victim needed to remain conscious and suffering for as long as possible, which required avoiding immediate kills while ensuring each arrow inflicted maximum pain. Contemporary accounts describe how these executions would begin. The first arrows would target the extremities, feet, calves, thighs, hands, and forearms. Each impact would send shock waves of pain through the victim's body as razor-sharp arrowheads sliced through muscle, scraped bone, and severed nerves. The victim would scream, writhe against restraints, and beg for mercy that never came. As more arrows found their marks, the body would become a grotesque pincushion, each protruding shaft quivering with the victim's frantic movements. Blood would begin flowing from dozens of wounds, soaking clothing and dripping into growing pools beneath the post. The psychological dimension of this execution was particularly sophisticated. Victims could see the archers assembling, could watch them test their bows and select arrows from their quivers. They would observe each archer draw, aim, and release, sometimes seeing the arrow in flight during the split second before impact. The anticipation between shots could stretch for minutes, allowing pain from previous wounds to fully register while dread of the next arrow mounted. Some victims would faint from pain or blood loss, only to be revived with water or stimulants so the execution could continue. The process might last hours, with later arrows targeting more vital areas, the chest, abdomen, and finally, when death was intended, the heart or throat. Witnesses to these executions reported lasting psychological impacts. The sound of arrows striking flesh, a wet thunk distinctly different from arrows hitting targets or ground, haunted observers for years afterward. The victims' evolving vocalizations, from defiant shouts to desperate screams to weak whimpers as blood loss and shock progressed, created an auditory memory that traumatized even hardened warriors. The visual tableau of a human body transformed into a bristling mass of arrow shafts, slumped against restraints, served as a powerful warning. The Mongols would often leave the body in place for days, allowing it to be thoroughly observed by local populations before disposal. The execution of Guyuk Khan's political enemies through the crushing platform method reveals another dimension of Mongol execution practices. As Genghis Khan's grandson and eventual Great Khan himself, Guyuk inherited not just the empire, but also the tradition of using executions as tools of political control. The crushing platform was a particularly elaborate contraption. A large wooden platform would be constructed, sometimes ornately decorated to mock the victim's former status. The condemned person would be placed beneath this platform, and then heavy objects, stones, iron weights, sometimes other prisoners or corpses, would be gradually loaded onto the platform from above. The horror of this execution lay in its predictable inevitability. The victim, lying beneath the platform, could hear each heavy object being added above them. They could feel the wood creaking as the weight increased, could sense the pressure beginning to build against their body. The platform itself was designed with a slight give to it, so it would gradually descend rather than collapsing all at once. This meant the victim experienced a slow, progressive crushing, with plenty of time to contemplate what was happening and no possibility of escape or survival. The psychological torture of knowing exactly how one would die, hearing it approach incrementally, may have been worse than the physical agony itself. As the weight increased, the victim would first feel pressure, uncomfortable but bearable. Then, as more objects were added, that pressure would become painful. Breathing would become difficult as the chest compressed, each breath requiring more effort than the last. The victim would feel their ribs beginning to bend inward, a sensation of being squeezed in a giant's fist. At a certain point, ribs would begin to crack and break, producing sharp pains that radiated through the torso. These fractures would sometimes puncture internal organs, lungs, liver, stomach, causing internal bleeding that added suffocation and drowning in one's own blood to the list of torments. The final stages of death by crushing are particularly gruesome. As the ribcage collapsed completely, the lungs would be unable to expand, making breathing impossible regardless of the victim's desperation. The heart, squeezed by the compressing chest cavity, would struggle to pump blood effectively. Blood pressure would skyrocket in the head and neck as circulation was impeded, causing excruciating pressure behind the eyes and in the skull. The victim might experience their eyeballs bulging from their sockets, their tongues swelling and protruding from their mouth, capillaries in their face bursting to create a grotesque purple-red complexion. Consciousness could persist through much of this, the brain desperately clinging to life even as the body systematically failed. One of the most psychologically devastating execution methods attributed to the Mongol period was the practice of progressive amputation. This technique was occasionally employed against spies, saboteurs, or individuals who had caused indirect harm to Mongol interests. The principle was straightforward but horrifying. The victim would be kept alive while parts of their body were systematically removed over a period of days or weeks. Unlike quick dismemberment, this execution was characterized by its deliberate slowness and the medical attention given to keeping the victim conscious and alive through the entire process. The procedure would begin with extremities, typically fingers and toes. Mongol executioners had learned through extensive practice exactly how to remove these appendages while minimizing immediate blood loss. Ligatures would be tightly bound around the digit before removal, cutting off circulation. The cutting itself would be done with sharp knives, often in a joint rather than through bone, to simplify the process. The immediate pain would be intense, a searing, burning agony as nerves were severed and exposed to air. But the psychological damage was perhaps more significant. Watching one's own body parts being removed, losing pieces of oneself, unable to prevent it. After each amputation, The wounds would be cauterized with hot iron or burning oil to prevent fatal bleeding. The smell of burning flesh, one's own flesh, combined with the visual horror of seeing the charred stumps where fingers or toes had been created a sensory nightmare. Victims would then be given time to partially recover, fed and kept hydrated before the next session. This might occur several days later, removing more digits or perhaps moving to larger extremities like hands or feet. The anticipation between sessions was its own form of torture, as victims knew another amputation was coming, but not when or what would be taken next. As the execution progressed, the victim would experience a bewildering array of physical and psychological torments. Phantom limb pain, where the brain continues to register sensation from removed body parts, would create confusion and additional suffering. The victim might feel itching, burning, or shooting pains in fingers they could see were gone. Each day they would wake and confront anew the reality of their mutilated state. The stumps and scars a constant reminder of what had been taken and what horrors might yet come. Sleep became difficult as position changes pressed injured areas against bedding, and nightmares of the amputation sessions haunted what little rest could be found. The final stages of progressive amputation executions typically involved removal of larger body parts, forearms, lower legs, eventually whole limbs at the shoulder or hip. Each of these amputations risked fatal shock or blood loss despite precautions, and executioners had to make careful medical calculations about how far they could proceed. The victim's psychological state by this point was typically one of complete dissociation or active psychosis, the mind unable to process the magnitude of the trauma. Some victims would beg for death, others would appear catatonic, and still others would experience breaks with reality, denying that the amputation had occurred or insisting their removed parts were still attached and functional. Genghis Khan's use of execution by exposure in the Gobi Desert represented a form of environmental execution that left no obvious evidence of direct violence. Victims would be stripped of clothing and supplies, then abandoned in the desert during appropriate seasons, summer for heat exposure or winter for cold. This method was occasionally used for criminals whose crimes didn't warrant more elaborate executions, or sometimes for religious purposes when the Mongols wished to let heaven decide the fate of an accused person. The cruelty lay not in active torture, but in the inevitable progression of environmental exposure leading to death. Summer exposure in the Gobi Desert subjected victims to temperatures regularly exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. Without water, death from dehydration would typically occur within 3 to 5 days, but the process was far from peaceful. The first stage would involve intense thirst as the body depleted its water reserves. The victim would feel their mouth and throat becoming dry, saliva production ceasing. As dehydration progressed, they would experience headaches, dizziness, and confusion. The skin would become dry and lose elasticity, and the victim might develop a sunken appearance as fluid left the tissues. Severe dehydration creates profound psychological effects. Hallucinations are common as the brain's functioning becomes impaired. Victims might see mirages of water sources or rescue parties approaching, only to have these visions dissolve into empty landscape. The desperate craving for water would overwhelm all other thoughts, driving victims to attempt to drink sand or their own urine in futile attempts to relieve the torment. As dehydration reached critical levels, the cardiovascular system would begin failing. The heart would struggle to pump increasingly viscous blood through constricting vessels, potentially leading to stroke or heart attack before actual death from dehydration. Winter exposure in the Gobi presented a different but equally horrific death. Temperatures could plunge to -20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Without protective clothing, hypothermia would set in within hours. The victim would first experience intense shivering as the body attempted to generate heat through muscle activity. This would be accompanied by numbness in the extremities as blood flow was redirected to vital organs in the core. As core body temperature dropped below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, confusion and poor decision-making would set in, a particularly cruel development since correct decisions might theoretically save the victim, but their impaired mental state prevented effective action. As hypothermia progressed, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing sometimes occurred. Victims would experience a false sensation of warmth and begin removing whatever minimal clothing they had, accelerating their decline. In the final stages, the victim might adopt a position called terminal burrowing, attempting to crawl into small spaces or under objects in a primitive response to seek shelter. Death would finally come as cardiac arrhythmias developed in the dangerously cold heart, or as the brain simply ceased functioning at such low temperatures. The corpses of those who died from exposure were rarely recovered, instead becoming part of the desert landscape, their bones eventually scattered by wind and scavenging animals, unmarked and unmourned. The Mongol practice of executing enemy commanders by having them trampled by their own captured horses represents a particularly symbolic method that combined practical considerations with psychological messaging. Horses were absolutely central to Mongol culture and military success. They were partners, transportation, weapons platforms, and wealth. To be killed by horses, especially one's own mounts, represented a profound inversion of natural order and a deeply shameful death. This execution method was occasionally applied to cavalry commanders who had fought effectively against the Mongols, particularly if they were captured with their personal horses. The execution would be conducted in an open area with good visibility, ensuring maximum audience attendance. The condemned commander would be secured to the ground, typically on their back, with limbs spread and firmly staked. Their own horses would be brought forward, sometimes agitated through various means, shouting, fire, or simply kept hungry, and then presented with feed just out of reach beyond where the victim lay. The horses, not understanding the situation, would be driven across the victim's body. The first passes might be almost accidental, hooves landing on or near the victim as the panicked animals sought to escape or reach whatever was attracting them. The physical trauma of being trampled is extreme and accumulative. A single horse hoof, carrying a fraction of an animal weighing 900 to 200 pounds, can exert tremendous pressure on a small area. When a hoof strikes the torso, ribs crack and shatter. If the skull is struck, the result is typically catastrophic skull fractures with immediate severe brain injury. Limbs struck by hooves would snap, compound fractures sending bone fragments through skin. The victim would experience waves of pain with each impact, their screams and thrashing potentially further agitating the horses and leading to more strikes. What made this execution particularly horrific was its chaotic nature. Unlike more controlled execution methods, there was a random quality to trampling. A horse might miss the victim entirely on one pass, allowing hope to briefly surge, only to have another horse strike a devastating blow moments later. The victim might survive dozens of hoof strikes, each causing individual injuries, before a critical blow finally ended their life. The cumulative damage, broken ribs, puncturing lungs and heart, shattered limbs bleeding profusely, abdominal strikes rupturing internal organs, cranial trauma causing brain hemorrhage, would eventually prove fatal. But the path to death was unpredictable and terrifying in its randomness. The symbolic dimension extended beyond the immediate execution. Forcing a commander to be killed by their own horses, animals they had trained, ridden into battle, and relied upon for survival, added emotional torment to physical agony. In their final moments, these commanders would look up to see not their trusted companions, but instruments of their destruction. For witnesses, particularly cavalry soldiers from the same army, seeing their commander's own horses turned into execution tools created a powerful psychological message. Everything you rely upon, everything you trust, can be turned against you by Mongol power. It was a demonstration of absolute dominance that transcended mere military defeat. Perhaps the most infamous mass execution attributed to Genghis Khan's forces was the use of human pyramids as crushing devices. Historical sources, particularly from the aftermath of the siege of Nishapur, describe a terrifying practice. Captured enemy soldiers and civilians would be organized into mass executions where layers of living prisoners would be stacked atop each other, the weight of upper bodies crushing those below. This represented execution not as individual punishment, but as systematic slaughter on an industrial scale designed to process thousands of prisoners quickly while maximizing terror. The practical logistics of such executions are grimly fascinating. In one account, following a particularly bitter siege where a Mongol prince had been killed, the Mongol forces allegedly executed the entire population of the city. Rather than individual killings, prisoners were organized into groups of 50 to 100. These groups would be forced into prepared pits or against walls. Then, methodically, Mongol soldiers would force additional layers of prisoners on top of the first layer. As each new layer was added, the weight would increase on those below. The bottom layers would experience progressively increasing pressure as the human pyramid grew higher. The physiological effects would be similar to the crushing platform method, but complicated by the irregular distribution of weight and the movements of those not yet crushed above. The bottom victims would feel weight settling onto them, pressure building on their backs, chests, and heads. As more bodies piled on, breathing would become nearly impossible. Those in middle layers would experience their own crushing while simultaneously contributing to the crushing of those below them, a horrible dual role of victim and unwilling executioner. The screaming would be cacophonous, a massive chorus of agony that observers described as sounding like damned souls in torment. Death in these mass crushings came from multiple causes. Asphyxiation was common as chests were compressed beyond the ability to draw breath. Broken ribs would puncture lungs and hearts. Skulls would crack under the pressure of bodies piled above. Some victims would experience positional asphyxia, where the position of their body prevented effective breathing even without direct pressure on the chest. The dying process would be staggered, with bottom-layer victims dying relatively quickly, while those higher up might survive longer, only to eventually succumb as the pyramid was built higher, or as those beneath them stopped resisting and their bodies settled, increasing pressure. The aftermath of these mass executions would be fields of corpses so densely packed that individual bodies were difficult to distinguish. The Mongols would sometimes leave these sites unburied as warnings to other cities considering resistance. The message was clear and horrifying. Resistance would lead not to honorable death in battle, but to anonymous suffocation beneath the bodies of fellow citizens. This transformation of human beings into mere crushing weight, stripping away all individual identity and dignity, represented perhaps the ultimate expression of the Mongol philosophy that resistance itself was an offense deserving complete annihilation. In examining these execution methods, we confront the disturbing intersection of military strategy, psychological warfare, and human capacity for inflicting suffering. Genghis Khan's approach to executions was never simply about killing. It was about creating such overwhelming fear that future enemies would surrender immediately, saving Mongol lives and resources. From this calculating perspective, each horrific execution was an investment in future conquests. The more terrible the method, the more effective it became as a deterrent. The stories of these deaths spread along trade routes faster than the Mongol armies themselves, preparing the psychological battlefield before a single soldier arrived. Yet we must also acknowledge the human cost of this strategy. Behind each method described here were real individuals who experienced these torments. They had names, families, dreams, and fears. Their final moments were filled with unimaginable agony and terror. The trauma extended beyond the victims to witnesses forced to watch, to communities that lost members in these brutal fashions. and to the generational legacy of fear that shaped societies for centuries afterward. The Mongol approach to execution created a cultural memory of terror that persisted long after the empire fragmented and declined. The practice of execution by being sewn into animal skins with living creatures represents another dimension of Mongol cruelty that combined physical torment with psychological horror. This method, documented in several medieval sources, involved sewing a condemned person into the fresh hide of a large animal, typically a horse or ox, along with various living creatures such as rats, snakes, or insects. The hide would then be left in the sun or near heat sources, causing it to contract as it dried, while the creatures inside, driven by hunger or distress, would attack the helpless victim trapped with them. The initial phase of this execution would involve the overwhelming sensory assault of being confined in darkness within the still warm hide of a freshly slaughtered animal. The smell would be nauseating: blood, viscera, and the distinctive odor of death mixed with the victim's own fear sweat. The victim would be unable to move significantly, bound within the contracting leather, and would feel the creatures placed inside with them beginning to move. If rats had been included, they would quickly become agitated by the confined space and darkness, their primitive survival instincts driving them to seek escape by any means, including gnawing through the only soft material available, the victim's flesh. Rats possess remarkably powerful jaws and sharp incisors that never stop growing, requiring them to constantly gnaw to keep the teeth worn down. When trapped and panicked, rats become voraciously destructive. They would begin by biting exposed areas, the face, hands, feet, but as desperation increased, they would burrow into the victim's body, seeking escape routes. Historical accounts describe victims being literally eaten alive from within, rats creating tunnels through soft tissue, consuming muscle, fat, and organs. The pain would be indescribable. Dozens of small, sharp teeth repeatedly biting, tearing, and consuming living flesh, nerve endings screaming with each attack. If snakes had been included instead of or in addition to rats, the psychological torment would be even more profound. Many individuals have instinctive fear responses to snakes, and being trapped in darkness with serpents would create overwhelming panic. Depending on the species, the snakes might be venomous, adding the terror of potential envenomation to the horror of confinement. Non-venomous snakes could still inflict painful bites, and their movement across the victim's skin, cool, dry scales sliding over flesh, would be deeply disturbing. The victim would feel the snakes coiling around limbs, moving across their face, potentially entering body cavities, all while unable to see or effectively defend themselves. The contracting hide added a progressive element to the torture. As it dried, it would tighten like a vice, compressing the victim's body gradually but inexorably. This compression would restrict breathing, increase claustrophobic panic, and force the trapped creatures into even closer contact with the victim. The victim would experience the dual torment of being slowly crushed, while simultaneously being consumed or attacked by the creatures sharing their prison. Death might come from suffocation, as the hide contracted too tightly to allow breathing, from blood loss and shock, as the creatures inflicted cumulative damage, or from sheer overwhelming trauma causing the heart to fail. The execution method known as the boats or scaphism, while more commonly associated with ancient Persians, was reportedly adapted and used occasionally by Mongol administrators in conquered Persian territories. This method involved trapping the victim between two boats or hollowed logs, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding. The victim would be force-fed milk and honey, and these substances would also be smeared on their exposed extremities. Then they would be left floating in stagnant water or exposed to sun, allowing nature to inflict the execution through insect infestation and the victim's own bodily functions. The initial discomfort would be relatively mild, cramping from the confined position, the heat of the sun, and thirst despite the force-feeding of milk and honey. However, the milk and honey served a sinister purpose. Force-fed in large quantities, they would inevitably cause severe diarrhea. Since the victim could not leave their position, they would be forced to defecate on themselves, the waste accumulating in the lower boat. This created an environment of unbearable filth and degradation, stripping away human dignity as effectively as any physical torture could. The real horror would begin within a day or two as insects arrived. Flies would be attracted to the honey on the exposed skin and the accumulating waste below. They would land in swarms, covering every exposed surface, crawling into the victim's eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. The constant sensation of insects crawling over skin, the sound of their buzzing directly in the ears, and the inability to brush them away would create maddening psychological distress. The flies would lay eggs in any available flesh, particularly around body cavities and in any open wounds. Within days, these eggs would hatch into maggots that would begin consuming the victim's flesh, particularly in the areas constantly soaked with waste. As the days progressed, the victim's condition would deteriorate catastrophically. The combination of exposure, dehydration despite the milk force feedings, infection from the maggot infestation, and sepsis from the constant exposure to waste would create systemic failure. The victim might develop gangrene in their extremities, visible as blackening tissue that would attract even more insects. Fever from infection would cause delirium and hallucinations. The psychological state would shift between lucid awareness of the horror and merciful unconsciousness. Death, when it finally arrived after potentially 2 weeks or more of suffering, would likely come from overwhelming infection, dehydration, or shock. The Mongol practice of executing enemy leaders through elaborate public humiliation before death served multiple purposes: punishment, entertainment for Mongol troops, and demoralization of the enemy population. One particularly detailed account describes the execution of a Turkish sultan who had resisted Mongol demands. Before his death, he was dressed in women's clothing and paraded through the streets of his own conquered capital on a donkey, forced to announce his own cowardice and failures to his former subjects. The psychological devastation of such treatment was intended to completely unmake the victim's identity and status. This public humiliation phase could last hours or even days before the actual execution. The victim would be subjected to constant verbal abuse, spitting, thrown refuse, and physical assault from both Mongol soldiers and the conquered population, many of whom might participate either from genuine anger or from fear of appearing sympathetic to the condemned. The victim would experience the complete collapse of their social identity, transformed from a figure of authority and respect to an object of contempt and ridicule. For individuals whose entire sense of self was bound up in their status and power, this psychological dissolution could be more agonizing than any physical torture. The final execution would sometimes be anticlimactic after the elaborate humiliation, a simple beheading or strangling, but the real purpose had already been achieved. The victim had been thoroughly broken, their legacy contaminated by the images of degradation that witnesses would remember and recount. In societies where honor and reputation were considered more valuable than life itself, this destruction of identity represented a fate worse than death. The victim's family and descendants would carry the shame for generations, and other potential resistors would consider whether they could endure such humiliation, often concluding that surrender was preferable. Genghis Khan's execution methods also included environmental manipulation on a massive scale. When dealing with particularly hated enemies or cities that had killed Mongol ambassadors, an unforgivable offense in Mongol culture, entire cities would be systematically destroyed, with populations executed and infrastructure demolished. But beyond this immediate destruction, the Mongols would sometimes engineer long-term environmental catastrophes. Irrigation systems that had sustained civilizations for centuries would be deliberately destroyed. Dams would be breached, fields flooded or drained, and crops burned. This wasn't execution of individuals, but execution of the very possibility of life in a region. As we conclude this examination of Genghis Khan's execution methods, we are left with uncomfortable questions about human nature and the relationship between civilization and violence. The Mongols created one of history's most successful empires through a combination of military innovation, administrative efficiency, religious tolerance, and calculated terror. The execution methods described here were integral to this success, serving as force multipliers that allowed relatively small Mongol armies to control vast territories. Terror worked. Cities surrendered to avoid the fate of those that had resisted, and the Mongol Empire expanded with a speed unprecedented in human history. Perhaps the most important lesson from this dark chapter of history is the resilience of human communities in the face of overwhelming brutality. Despite the best efforts of conquerors to break spirits through horrific executions, cultures survived, adapted, and eventually reasserted themselves. The Mongol Empire's execution methods achieved their immediate tactical purposes, but failed to permanently subjugate the human drive for autonomy and dignity. In remembering these horrors, we honor the victims who endured them and recommit ourselves to building societies where such calculated cruelty becomes not just illegal, but truly unthinkable, where the very concept of weaponizing human suffering is rejected at the deepest cultural and moral levels.